My name is Dr. Eris Valerius. The title is important. I earned it through a decade of wrestling with abstract mathematics until it yielded its secrets. At Axion Capital, however, it was mostly an inconvenience. A title is a hard thing to steal. Credit, on the other hand, is liquid. It flows to the most charismatic speaker in the room, and in every room at Axion, that speaker was Declan Hale. My world was a small, quiet island in the roaring ocean of the trading floor. My desk was black lacquered steel. On it sat three things that were mine. A single perfect white orchid, which I coaxed into blooming twice a year. A worn hardcover of Gödel, Escher, Bach, its spine softened by 1,000 rereadings. And a ceramic mug, heavy and dark, from which I drank Lapsang Souchong tea. The traders hated the smell. They said it was like drinking a campfire. I found the smoky scent grounded me. It was a shield against the office's olfactory assault of desperation and cheap cologne. Beside my desk, on its own dedicated server rack that hummed with a quiet authority, was my life's work. Synapse. The partners called it the firm's proprietary trading algorithm. That was like calling a human brain a proprietary calculation machine. It was technically true, but missed the point entirely. Synapse didn't just track markets, it listened. It performed what I called sentiment triangulation, scraping and parsing millions of data points a second. News headlines, social media posts, the subtle shifts in language in a central bank report. It detected the birth of a market-moving narrative before the humans involved even knew they were writing it. Synapse wasn't code. It was a digital extension of my own intuition. I had poured my entire worldview into its logic. It was, for all practical purposes, me, and it made the firm obscene amounts of money. Declan Hale arrived on a Tuesday. He was 32, with a face that was handsome in the way of a catalog model, and an ego that entered the room a full 2 seconds before he did. His father was one of the fund's biggest clients, which explained his title, Head of Trading, better than any resume could. He wore Gucci loafers that were perpetually scuffed at the toe, a detail that suggested he kicked his desk when he was frustrated. I cataloged it. Data is data. He approached my desk, his voice a theatrical boom designed to be overheard. He said, "Eris, my machine whisperer. Let's synergize." He gestured at my monitors, which displayed the elegant, flowing data streams of Synapse at work. He asked if we could inject more blockchain into the substrate. He said it with the confident ignorance of a man who has never been told he is wrong. I explained, slowly, that blockchain was a distributed ledger technology and had no practical application in high-frequency sentiment analysis. He just nodded, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. He said, "Great. Actionize that." And then he was gone, leaving a cloud of buzzwords and expensive cologne in his wake. The inciting incident, the moment the first crack appeared in my professional foundation, was a partners' meeting a month later. I was required to attend, but not expected to speak. I sat in the back, nursing my tea, while Declan stood at the head of the long mahogany table. The slide deck projected behind him was mine, my charts, my data visualizations, my meticulously crafted performance metrics. Declan gestured to a graph showing a near-vertical profit curve. He said, "As you can see from the strategy I've implemented over the last quarter, my targeted approach is yielding significant alpha." The partners, all men in their late 50s who saw the market as a series of gut feelings, nodded in unison. They loved Declan. He spoke their language. A language of aggressive metaphors and unearned confidence. He had no idea what he was really looking at. He was like a child pointing at a page of calculus and taking credit for its elegance. I felt a cold, quiet fury begin to build. It was a low-frequency hum beneath the surface of my composure. The next beat in my public execution came a week later. Synapse had flagged an anomaly, a subtle but persistent pattern of misinformation campaigns targeting the supply chains for refined nickel. It was a whisper, but a dangerous one. I brought it to Declan. I recommended we unwind our position before the market caught on. My desk was a fortress of data supporting this conclusion. He barely glanced at it. He leaned back in his chair, making it groan in protest. He smiled a patronizing, lazy smile. "That's all very academic, Eris," he said, "but we need to see the profit and loss, not the PhD." He then gestured vaguely at my comfortable, practical shoes. He added, "I guess we know who's not in the bonus pool." He told me to stick to the code and leave the big picture to the strategists. He held his position. 2 days later, the nickel market convulsed. A major supplier announced a catastrophic failure. The market plummeted. Axion lost $80 million. In the emergency meeting, Declan blamed the volatility on unforeseen geopolitical factors. He never made eye contact with me. The partners nodded and agreed. It was an act of God, not an act of an idiot. The personal betrayal arrived in a manila envelope. Declan summoned me to his glass-walled office. It overlooked the entire trading floor, a modern-day panopticon for a king who didn't understand his own kingdom. An HR representative and a junior lawyer were already there, their faces set in masks of corporate neutrality. They were an audience. This was theater. Declan slid a contract across the polished surface of his desk. He said it was a standard intellectual property reassignment. He said corporate was just cleaning up the paperwork on Synapse. I picked it up. My hands were steady. I read the key clauses. It was a complete abdication. It would transfer the ownership of United States patent 7,432,981 to Axion Capital. My patent. The one I filed as a junior analyst, when Synapse was just a quirky side project the firm hadn't bothered to fund or claim. The contract offered a one-time bonus for this transfer, $5,000, for my entire professional soul. I looked up from the paper. I met his smug, expectant gaze, and I said a single word: number. His smile didn't just vanish, it was annihilated. This was the moment he had engineered. He had expected me to fold, to be grateful for the scraps. My refusal was not on his flowchart. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a tone of feigned disappointment. "Aris, you have to see this from a team perspective. If you can't be a team player..." He let the threat hang in the air between us. I did not flinch. I just watched him. His frustration finally boiled over. He slapped the desk with an open palm. "Fine. You're terminated. Effective immediately." He nodded to the HR representative. As I opened my mouth to speak, my laptop on the conference table went dark. The network connection was severed. My digital life, my access, my entire professional existence was amputated in an instant. A security guard, a man named Frank who always complimented my orchid, appeared at the door. He looked deeply uncomfortable. I stood up. I did not plead. I did not argue. My dignity was the one thing he couldn't fire me for. I gathered my purse, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked Declan dead in the eye. I said, "You will regret this." He laughed. It was a loud, ugly sound. He laughed as Frank escorted me from the office, past the rows of traders who suddenly found their shoes fascinating. I walked through the heart of the world I had built, a ghost already. The humiliation was total, public, and exquisitely cruel. It was also a fatal miscalculation. What he didn't understand was that my patent was not just a piece of paper, it was a key, and he had just handed it back to me. My apartment was a sanctuary of minimalist order, white walls, clean lines, and silence. The cardboard box Frank had packed with my desk items sat by the door, the orchid, the book, the mug. It felt like debris from a shipwreck, an ugly intrusion of a world that had just violently ejected me. I did not unpack it. Instead, I walked to my home office. I opened my personal laptop. I navigated to a web portal I had built years ago. It had a simple, clean interface. The page was mostly blank with a single line of text. It read, "Querying Axion HR server for employment status of Dr. Eris Valerius." Below it, a status indicator blinked green. Active. I had coded it to check once per hour, every hour for the last 8 years. A quiet digital sentry. I refreshed the page. The indicator flickered, then turned a stark, brutal red. Terminated. The change in status triggered a new protocol. A single button appeared on the screen. It was labeled, "Execute Agreement Clause 11B." Clause 11b. A little bit of legal poetry I had insisted on in my initial overlooked onboarding contract addendum. It stated that the firm's license to operate under my patent was contingent on my continuous, good-standing employment. Termination of my employment for any reason resulted in the immediate and automatic revocation of that license. This was my hidden feature, my dead man's switch, my personal, legal, and technical ace. He thought he was stealing a car, but he had no idea the engine was wirelessly tethered to the original owner, and I was about to turn it off. My finger hovered over the trackpad. This was not an act of emotional, frantic hacking. There was no rage in the gesture. It was the calm, deliberate movement of a mathematician solving an equation. It was the final, logical step. I clicked the button. A confirmation dialog appeared. "Are you sure you wish to execute?" I clicked yes. The page refreshed to a simple confirmation. Legal notifications dispatched. License for U.S. Patent 7,432,981 has been revoked, effective immediately. An automated, legally binding email was now in the inbox of every senior partner at Axion Capital. Another was in the inbox of my intellectual property lawyer. The system was now rejecting the antagonist. The trap was sprung. I closed the laptop. I walked to my kitchen. I filled the kettle with filtered water. I measured out a precise spoonful of smoky lapsang souchong leaves into my teapot. I went through the methodical, comforting ritual of brewing my tea. The calculation was complete. The execution had begun. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a profound sense of peace. The storm was coming for Axion Capital, and I was going to enjoy every moment of it. The next morning, I imagined the scene at Axion with a cold, cinematic clarity. The air on the trading floor would be electric with arrogant confidence. Declan would be at the center of it, strutting between the terminals. He would be holding his absurdly large coffee mug, a piece of white ceramic with the word Alpha printed on it in big black letters. He would deliver some hollow motivational speech, full of misused sports metaphors and empty jargon about crushing the competition. I could almost hear it, a symphony of entitled ignorance. Then, the opening bell, a shrill electronic clang that signaled the start of the hunt. I pictured Declan raising his mug in a toast. "Print us some money, people! Activate Synapse!" And then the beautiful, inevitable silence. The traders would tap their keyboards. Their confident expressions would curdle into confusion. On hundreds of high-resolution monitors, the familiar, elegant interface of Synapse would fail to appear. Instead, there would be a single line of plain, unstyled text, a digital tombstone. License. Invalid. U.S. Patent 7,432,981. Refer to counsel. The chaos would not be immediate. It would be a cascade. First, a confused murmur spreading through the rows of traders. Then, the first panicked shouts as they realized they were blind. They couldn't execute new trades. Worse, they couldn't exit their overnight positions. They were strapped into a crashing airplane and the controls were dead. The big board on the wall, the one that tracked the firm's real-time profit and loss, would begin its inexorable turn from green to red. I watched his world collapse in real time, not with my eyes, but with my mind. Declan's public unmasking would be glorious. I pictured him, his face flushed, screaming at the head of information technology. He would ask if they had tried rebooting it. He would insist it was just a glitch, a bug. He, a man who thought blockchain was something you sprinkled into software, would try to explain the intricacies of my system to the frantic partners. The look on his face when he realized his fatal error, that the problem wasn't technical but legal, would be a masterpiece of dawning horror. He had stolen a crown, and now, in front of the entire court, it was dissolving into dust in his hands. The call came at 9:45 in the morning. The caller ID showed it was from Marcus Thorne, the firm's senior managing partner. A man who hadn't spoken my name in 3 years. I let it ring 4 times before answering. His voice was strained, stripped of its usual booming authority. "Eris, we have a situation. I feigned a polite confusion. "Oh? I'm sorry to hear that. I'm no longer with the company, Marcus." He cut me off. "We know. We need you to come in. Immediately." There was a raw, naked panic in his voice that I savored like a fine wine. I told him I might be able to find some time in my schedule. I agreed to be there in an hour. I took my time getting ready. I chose a charcoal gray dress, impeccably tailored. It was a suit of armor. I did my makeup with a surgeon's precision. When I looked in the mirror, I saw not a victim, but an architect. The architect of Declan Hale's professional demise. The emergency boardroom was thick with the smell of fear. The partners were all there, a collection of pale, aging men in expensive suits that suddenly looked like costumes. Declan was at the far end of the table. He looked shrunken, hollowed out. His usual charismatic glow was gone, replaced by the waxy pallor of a man who had just witnessed a public execution and was beginning to suspect it was his own. He avoided my gaze. Marcus started talking. A rambling, desperate monologue about partnership, about loyalty, about making things right. He offered me my job back. He offered me a raise, a new title, head of innovation. I let him talk until he had exhausted his supply of platitudes. The room fell silent. All eyes were on me. I placed my hands on the cool, polished surface of the table. My voice, when I spoke, was calm and quiet, but it cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. "For a year I have sat in this room and watched you," I began, looking at each partner in turn. "I have watched you listen to a man who does not understand the first thing about the technology this firm is built on." I then turned my full attention to Declan. "I watched you use my work to build your career. I watched you take my data and call it your strategy. You called me a number cruncher. You were wrong. I was not your employee crunching numbers. You were my client, licensing my intellectual property." The look on his face when he realized it was everything I had hoped for. The confusion, the denial, the dawning, sickening comprehension. He finally understood. He had not fired a subordinate. He had breached a contract with his most critical supplier. I let the weight of that sink in. My mind was the asset, and your access to it was a privilege. That privilege has been revoked. Declan started to sputter, a string of incoherent noises. I cut him off with two final, precise words. "The free trial has expired." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting, the sound of power, real and earned, asserting itself over the fraudulent and inherited. I had them. And now I would tell them what it would cost to be saved. The partners stared at me, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning respect. The power in the room had shifted. It was no longer theirs to give, but mine to take. I leaned forward slightly. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I said, "I am not interested in my old job. I am not interested in a new title created to placate me. I am interested in a new structure, a correct one." Marcus Thorne, the senior partner, finally found his voice. It was a hoarse whisper. "What do you want, heiress?" I laid out my terms. They were not a negotiation. They were a declaration. First, I would be appointed the new head of quantitative strategy. This was not a promotion. It was a correction. The role would report directly to the board, not to any intermediary. It would have absolute authority over all algorithmic trading, research, and development. Second, I would receive a 7-figure salary, retroactive to the day Declan was appointed his fraudulent position. A penalty for their lack of oversight. I would also receive a guaranteed percentage of the profits generated by Synapse and any future systems I developed. I would no longer be an expense on a spreadsheet. I would be a partner, in fact, if not in name. Third, and this was for me, Declan Hale is to be terminated, not quietly, not with a golden parachute. He is to be fired for gross incompetence. He will be escorted from the building today. His name will be removed from the company's history. He will be erased. The partners didn't even confer. Marcus just nodded slowly, agreed to everything. He looked at Declan, a man he had championed just yesterday, and his expression was pure ice. He said, "Declan, you're done. Get out." The falling action was swift and beautiful. While Declan was being unceremoniously escorted out by Frank, a scene I watched with intimate satisfaction through the glass wall of the boardroom, I took out my phone. I logged into my private portal. A new option was available: reactivate license. I tapped the screen. A single encrypted command shot across the network. On the trading floor, the screens flickered. The ugly license invalid message vanished, replaced by the elegant, familiar interface of Synapse. The system began its work, untangling the mess of the morning's chaos with a speed and efficiency that was almost terrifying. The river of red on the big board slowed, then stopped, then began to flow, tentatively at first, and then with gathering force, back into the green. I had restored order with a single tap of my finger. I had demonstrated my absolute control. My resolution was quiet, but total. The next day, I walked into Declan's old office. The alpha mug was gone. His personal effects had been swept away. The space was a blank canvas. It was larger than my old desk, with a commanding view of the floor. The kingdom was now mine. I did not fill it with bravado. I walked over to the large window. I watched the traders below, their movements now guided by the calm, relentless logic of my system. There was a new energy on the floor. The frantic, nervous edge was gone, replaced by a focused calm. They had their North Star back. I turned away from the window. The box of my belongings had been brought up from my apartment. I opened it. I took out my single white orchid and placed it on the corner of the vast, clean desk. Its quiet, living beauty was a stark contrast to the sterile power of the office. It was a reminder of what was real. I took out my worn copy of Gödel, Escher, Bach, and placed it beside the orchid. Finally, I took out my dark ceramic mug. I would have my Lapsang Souchong brought here from now on. A new order was established, an order based on competence, not charisma, on merit, not nepotism, on the simple, undeniable power of being the one person in the room who truly knew how the whole thing worked. My name was Dr. Eris Valerius, and in my kingdom, that title finally meant everything. The triumph was not loud. It was a deep, resonant, and intensely personal satisfaction. It was the quiet hum of a perfectly running machine. My machine.